Now that we've gone through the basic theory of writing functions in Matlab, let's actually get hands-on and produce the first function of our own, and then let's see how to actually call it or how to use it within a script. So in this first example, let's assume that we want to write a function that will calculate the account balance after we've deposited the amount of money M for a period of n years and with interest rate R. This should be rate. So this should look familiar when it comes to the previous exercises we've been doing. So we know that this could be done either in a loop. So we have the initial balance. Now if we think with no function, so the initial balance would be something, and then for the years I from 1 to n, we would be having this balance being updated, that it's the balance again, and then 1 plus r, so it's multiplied, and then we have end. So that's how we would have done it before. Without a loop, that's possible as well, so we could use the general formula that balance is actually that initial deposit. So M and then times 1 plus interest rate, power n, where n says how many years. So you see, this is like a formula, and we would like that formula kind of to be represented as a function in Matlab. So remember, function always starts with function definition line, and this is what I have now in here. So first there comes the command function that tells Matlab we will be writing a function. Then there comes the output argument, and that means that whatever will be calculated in my body of the function, the final result should be called balance, so that it can be kind of given out from the function as an output. And then I decided to call my function my money, so this is the function name. And then in round parentheses I have my input argument, so I have the initial amount of money, I have the number of years I want to keep the money in the bank, and the interest rate. And then here is the body. So in this case, it's a very simple example. The body actually has just one line, and it is in here. I'm now using this overall formula, so I'm not interested in seeing the balance over specific years. I just want to know the final value after n years. So when I have body of the function, what you always have to make sure is that everything that is within your body is being defined. And what does it mean? Some variables may be defined within the body, for instance, if they belong to the algorithm you're using. For instance, when we had the tasks of summing a number of things up, always when you start the summation, we had to define that sum first equal to 0. That belongs to the summing algorithm. So that's when that sum would have to be actually included within your function. But now, in this case, what I need to calculate the balance is the initial money, the interest rate, and the number of years, how long the money is being kept. And I can see that all three of them are input arguments, so I don't have to worry about defining anything anymore in my body, because whatever the formula contains is either known, like the 1 here, or is being given as input argument. And that calculation, as it happens, is being assigned to balance variable, and this balance is the very same name it has to be, is now my output argument. So how does it work in practice when we then want to call that function? Well, then within a script we would define specific values for which we want the calculation to be done. So for instance, I want initial money to be 10,000, number of years 15, and I know the interest rate is 4%, and then I want to call my function and calculate. So now calling the function means that you have to again give its name. Then in round parentheses, you have to give in the input arguments, and now notice they have to be in the same order. So if in my function definition the first input argument was money, it means that I have to make sure that I put money as the first one in here as well. And then second one was number of years, and third one was the rate. And then you see I have them now defined here before I call the function, so I give specific values, and then these values will be used in here. That line where you define the values has to be placed then before the line when you call your function. So let's have a look in Matlab. Now I'll show you the two cases. I said before that when you write a function, it can be either a separate function file or it can be part of your script. So now I'll show you the part first when it's a script file, or when it's part of the script file, and then the one as a separate file. So again, we have to start from defining the function, and I was saying that the output will be balance, the function will be called my money, and it will need the amount of money initially deposited, number of years to be kept, and the interest rate. And then I was saying that the formula was m times 1 plus rate power n. And now since my function is actually part of the script file, I have to end it with an end. That's a requirement in here. If it's part of a code, bigger code, you saw before the end was there, Matlab was complaining and emphasizing this, underlining it with red color. So that's a hint for you that the end is missing. So now when this formula is ready, then I can choose any values of m, n, and r and call my function. So let's take again the ones from the example. M was 10,000, n was 15 years, and the rate was 4%. So I put it directly, since now I know that my function is written in this way, that it's a 1 plus r, so I have to immediately express rate already as the decimal and not just 4, like 4%, but 0.04 to represent 4%. And then when you call the function, the easiest way to call it, not to get confused with the order of parameters, is to just copy this portion of definition line where you actually have right away the order of input parameters, you know how many outputs are coming, and you know the name, so you will not accidentally make a typo, as you call it. So now when I run this one, you can see that I'm getting balance equals that. So that's the answer for these particular inputs. I could call it again. Maybe let's call it now balance 1 and change these values a bit. So let's make the money more, let's make more years, and let's make maybe smaller interest rate. So we run it again, and now you can see there are two different outputs because I've called my function twice with two different sets of input arguments. Now, what is important also to say is that when you call your function, the only thing, or there are two things that are important. What is the name of your function? If you type the name incorrectly, like for instance I put small m in here, Matlab will complain that it cannot find an exact match for my money. So remember to type the function name correctly. The second thing is the names of the input arguments. Actually, they don't have to be named exactly the same way like they are in your function definition. They can be anything. I can, for instance, I'll call this M1, N1, and R1, and then pass those as my inputs, M1, N1, and R1. Sorry, not here, but in the place where I call it. So in here, 1, 1, and 1. So this will work because Matlab doesn't care that they are different names. What it does is that it knows that the first item given in here actually means what is m in here. That's basically how it understands it. I could, for instance, I'll call it once again. Let's take it balance 2. I can as well put just manually the values. That's why you can see it doesn't really matter what you would call them. The only thing that matters is that the order is correct. Because Matlab will know that, for instance, what comes third in here, in my formula, is the interest rate. So I can't swap, for instance, any of them. I can't swap the order, because then the different values would be used in here and the answer would be not correct. But now when I run it like this, balance 1 and 2 should be the same, because I still use the same values. In the first case, when I was calling it, I just used predefined variable values, and in here I just put them directly as values without predefining the names. And the second way to make and use a function is when it is defined as a separate file. So now I'll make a new file, and I will copy into it that function, so only the function in here. Then I'll save it. I'll save it with a bit different name so that you can see it works. And now a couple of comments. First is that the name of the function, so what is here, has to be the same as the name of the file. So now you see there is this kind of orange underline. It's a warning. Matlab lets you know that there is something wrong in here, and when it comes to the name, you should immediately recognize that probably you have forgotten to use the same name within as your function name and the file name. So when I change to the same name in here, that orange warning disappears. Second thing is that since it's one function within one file, this AND is not needed. It's okay to have it, but it's not necessary. So this function will work perfectly fine if that AND is not there. So now when I save it and I go back to my file in here, the only thing that is necessary now, or that is left for this to work, is to be sure that this mymoney2 function is actually saved in the same folder where the script is. Now I know it is the case because I have saved it in the same one. So now I'll just say balance 3 and my money, and for instance I will use again those MNR values, and of course not my money anymore. I want to use the one from the file, which is actually called my money2. So we run, and you can see that now this balance 3 was done with the same arguments as the very first balance calculation, so now these values are the same. And then within this script, remember that anything that is part of the script itself has to be above the function. So I could not continue my script in here and say whatever, some assignment or something. You see this one is already underlined in red because as the warning here says, function definitions in a script must appear at the end of the file. Move statements to before the functions. So it will only work if I take this away and move it up here. You can have more functions, that's okay, and then always you have to remember that each one of them has to be closed with an end, so Matlab knows where the function starts and ends. And of course, as with any other programming, any other pieces of code, something can go wrong. And let's see what would be the most common errors. So we have already seen the one with the mistyped name, so that's one we've covered. Another type of errors relates to input and output arguments. So for instance, here we have a code where we define a function. It's called my money. It has inputs M, N, and R, and then we have the formula that calculates it, and we say that we assign this to variable balance. And then when we call the function in our script, we define the 3 values, that's okay, and then we call the function, we give those inputs, m and r, and we assign the result to variable b. Now, the error says too many output arguments. What does it mean? Well, if we look carefully, we have forgotten to tell Matlab that balance is actually an output argument of our function. So what should have been there is this balance equals and then function name and so on. Since we haven't done it, Matlab doesn't expect any outputs from here. So that's why it is confused when we actually tell it that the calculation from here should be assigned, the output should be assigned to variable b. Because there is no output. By function definition line, nothing is an output, so it can't be, if it's nothing in here, we can't assign it to variable b. So that's one thing what can come across as problematic. And then another one is in here, too many input arguments. So for instance, I have now definition line or definition of a function again, which looks the same as in the previous example, now corrected that we have defined the output in here. So now we know that Matlab should expect that this function produces an output. But now when we call the function, we actually have one extra input in here. We declare that there will be actually 4 variables used in the calculation, and then the error says too many input arguments. So it warns us, it means that we've given 4 in here, but the way how the function was written only expects less than 4. We can't know from here how many, too many, but at least we know it's at least 1. So that's why whenever you try to call a function, make sure that you call it correctly, and that's why the best way probably is always to pick up this definition line. If it's your own function, copy it into your script and then put in the right names of the inputs and outputs what you want to have. When you use ready built-in functions from Matlab, the simplest way is to copy a piece of code from help. When you look in help how given function is being used, it has those lines of examples. So if you copy that example, then you will also keep track of having correct name, having correct number of inputs, and possibly outputs. One last comment to be done as a general information for functions is that variables in functions are by default local. So that means, let's jump directly into the code and explain what it means. For instance, in here, in this function, whatever is in here, so m, r, n, and even this balance name are local. It means that they are not being seen outside. Now, to show you exactly what that means, I'll call this mx, nx, and rx. I just want to make sure that I'm not having in my script, any variables called the same way as what I have in the functions. So you can see now, nowhere in my actual script do I have m, n, r, or balance itself. But despite that, when I run my code, it runs. So there is no problem that these names are not the same as there. And if you look at the workspace, you will not find anywhere m, n, r, or balance. And this exactly means that these variables are local. How it helps now is that, for instance, and one more reason why it's good to write functions when you have a big program, because this reduces your worries about repeating names of variables. So some portion of the code can be written as a function where all the variables in that function will be local, which means they are not kind of reserved. And in your main script, you can still use those variable names for other purposes without worrying that maybe you lose some values, or maybe you would get some errors related to the type and size of the variables. It is possible to make variables global, and that means that you would have to add it explicitly in your code. and it means that you have to kind of declare global and give the variable name, and then that means that that particular variable will then have a value the same across all the files and functions where it has been declared global.